The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword has been one of Nintendo's most controversial Zelda games. Its biggest problem was its motion controls, something most gamers saw as a gimmick and not a way to play a full-on 20+ hour RPG. And who can blame them, right? Regardless if it worked perfectly for you or not, the controls weren't practical, especially when compared to every other main console Zelda release. But with Skyward Sword HD now coming to the Nintendo Switch, Nintendo has solved that issue and added button controls back, giving players the option to now choose between the two. So, now with the most glaring problem of this game fixed, I think we're done here. Skyward Sword HD is worth it, and you should totally get it. Anyways, thank you all so much for watching. I've been ZeldaMaster, and I'll see you all in the next one. Oh, that wasn't convincing enough? I really need more reasoning behind why the game is worth it? Okay, roll the intro. Skyward Sword is the first game canonical within the entire Zelda timeline, predating the establishment of Hyrule and introducing the first incarnations of Hyrule's hero and its soon-to-be princess. The game holds so much important lore that has an effect on the entire series. The game itself plays like most Zelda games, with Link slowly awakening his power, this time for the very first time, as he makes his way through complex dungeons and temples, obtaining items that will further help him along the way. But what separates this game from the rest of the series is how heavy the story carries this game. Unlike a game like Breath of the Wild, where you can literally skip the entire story and still beat the game, Skyward Sword strings itself together with chapters of stories, making for a decent chunk of your playthrough consisting of cutscenes. While prior games in the series were similar, with Link following the story to slowly open up the game, Skyward Sword took it a step further with progression. It sort of reminded me of a JRPG with how linear sections were, to reach new parts of the story and continue the game. And that fact alone may be a bummer to Zelda fans, as the game does lack exploration compared to most other games in the series. The game's overworld acts as an oversimplified version of the Wind Waker's, with having to use the means of transportation to reach different areas, from islands to different parts of the surface. But unlike Wind Waker, there aren't that many secret islands in the sky to find, and everything on the surface must be explored when completing the story, so the feeling of exploring for secrets really lacks in this game compared to the Wind Waker. Pretty much every major area that you find only opens up with the story, and it's usually a straight path to explore. On top of that, the surface areas that you can explore are also very linear and didn't connect to other provinces. Each of these three areas have a starting point, which is where you first land, and an ending point, which is where the dungeon lays at the end of that journey. And after that, you sort of re-explore the same three areas in each major arc of the game, slowly adding new things to them. This was very limiting in terms of exploration, and honestly one of the game's biggest complaints outside of motion controls. It relied too heavily on reusing the little land you had to explore, and focused more on using the areas as gaps between each part of the story. But, with all of that said, if you can look past how this isn't the same as other Zelda games, it's still a really good game. As sorta mentioned before, I like to consider Skyward Sword as the JRPG of the Zelda series. What I mean by that is how the game focuses more on the story and its world building than the freedom of exploration. Skyward Sword's way of adventure is to follow Link's destiny as he attempts to save Princess Zelda and awaken the powers of the Goddess Sword. And this is the first Zelda game where I really felt the rush of wanting to do just that. Unlike almost every other Zelda game, where once the game opens up for you, you want to explore and leave everything else on the back burner, in Skyward Sword, I wanted to save Zelda and figure out what's happening. The story really hooked me in, and with each step I took, I realized I was one step behind Zelda, making me eager to keep moving and reach the outcome. And with each linear area, from the temples to the sky, to even exploring the surface, They just acted as a gap I had to close to continue my journey as I pieced the story of Skyward Sword. And that honestly is what makes this game so great. It doesn't need to follow the exact same formula the series always had. It wanted to establish a real origin story to the entire series, and give us meaning behind the Legend of Zelda and its chosen hero, and that is exactly what this game gives. I really think that the story alone should make this game an instant purchase for any Zelda fan. It's the origin of Zelda, literally. It tells the story of the first Zelda to ever come down to Hyrule, along with its hero. The origin of how the royal family came to be, and a glimpse of Hyrule before it was even called Hyrule. This game acts as the start of almost every iconic thing we see repeat within the series till today. As believe it or not, even the game's title, Skyward Sword, references the creation of the most iconic weapon within the series. Yes, the Master Sword. The Blade of Evil's Bane that you see in almost every Zelda game to date, Skyward Sword tells the origin of its creation, and why the game is pretty much named after the sword, as the Master Sword is the Skyward Sword. With it once being known as the Goddess Sword held in the sky, you have Link team up with its spirit that resides within it, Fi, to use the sacred flames found on the surface and temper the sword into the Master Sword, becoming the same blade that still remains in Hyrule tens of thousands of years later. So again, outside of the lack of exploration or the reuse of similar areas and linear nature of how the game progresses, this is the same game to establish the story of the entire series, and it does an amazing job doing so. To having a fully orchestrated soundtrack becoming one of my favorite soundtracks within the series, to introducing other RPG elements like item and shield upgrades that surprisingly are better than Breath of the Wild, as you can actually repair your shield before it breaks, and upgrade main items like your bow and slingshot. And overall have some of the most well-designed dungeons within the series, and the best storytelling within the series to date. I really think that Skyward Sword has a fair share of positives that go overlooked. So if you've been convinced that Skyward Sword is a bad Zelda game, I think you should then ask yourself this: is it a bad game altogether? If you looked at it like a JRPG which focuses on story first, would you really consider this a bad video game? Especially now that the main excuse of motion controls will no longer be an issue. I honestly hope that Skyward Sword's image changes for the better after this HD release, as I always thought this was one of the better games within the series and one of my favorite games of all time. So please, let me know your thoughts on Skyward Sword and this video in general. This video was something I wanted to make to help elaborate why I'm personally so excited for this game, even though I don't see that being the case with many others. Anyways though, thank you all so much for watching. I've been ZeldaMaster, and I'll see you all in the next one. Actually, I'm not done here. I doubt this video was able to really persuade anyone that is already on the fence of getting Skyward Sword to get it, as if you are a Zelda fan, you're probably already convinced. And sadly, with how the internet works, once an opinion is popular enough, it's hard to change that perspective. People will only remember what was first said and never look more into it. Skyward Sword will probably always be memed as one of the worst Zelda games, even though it has so much more to offer, and really isn't that bad when considered to top-down Zelda games, which have been much more restricted than any other 3D Zelda title. Though I think the fate of Skyward Sword was already decided before the game was ever released, and it didn't matter what happened after people got their hands on it. As while this game had so much ambition for a Wii title, the game came out a little too late in the console's life cycle. I remember for the longest time this game was known as Zelda Wii, and we knew nothing about it. All we saw was one promotional art of Link and Fi standing in this very dark orange-like poster. But when Nintendo finally decided to reveal Skyward Sword, it was a bit too late with the decision of wanting to fully commit to having the entire game heavily based off of motion controls. With Twilight Princess being originally for the GameCube and receiving a Wii port alongside it, they added motion controls into the Wii version, with minor things like gaming, which could be turned off, and basically having to shake your Wiimote in order to swing. Doing it acted as if you were clicking the B button, which didn't really matter how you swung the controller, as it just registered as a button press. And already that felt unnecessary for the game, but it was easy to look past as it didn't restrict you to using the motion controls in order to play the entire game. Skyward Sword, on the other hand, took this concept one step further and really forced the player to treat the Wiimote and nunchuck as if they were Link's sword and shield. But from the moment the gameplay was revealed to us, was the moment all expectations dropped for the game. I mean, as exciting as it was to be getting the next main game in the Zelda series that predates every other game in the timeline, and on the special occasion of the series' 25th anniversary, all that hype was gone the second they saw Miyamoto play a second of the game. I mean, it was awkward. Even during their presentation, it wasn't working well, and I'll be honest, I wasn't looking forward to it. But again, after I played the game, I was able to look past all that. But sadly, I can't say that for the rest. It really didn't matter how good this game could have been. It was already sold off as the worst Zelda game within the series by tons of fans, whether they played it or not. The problem is, the game came out during the end of that weird era of motion control hype. After the Wii and Xbox Connect, game companies wanted to focus on the next generation of systems, mainly improving on performance and quality over weird controller gimmicks. From there, it seemed that Nintendo was no longer competing in the console wars, but took their own path. As along Skyward Sword's release in 2011, titles like Skyrim and Dark Souls were released that same year. But unlike those games, Skyward Sword was still held back by an outdated console that couldn't even output in HD. And if that wasn't a problem enough, it also had the motion control gimmick a few years too late, a fad that people were completely done with. I feel like this was the time Nintendo fell off the map in terms of the console wars, and it mainly became about Sony's PlayStation versus Microsoft's Xbox. Nintendo was just considered the weird gimmick console for certain fans or children and families. And it didn't help that Nintendo's next console, the Wii U, continued the weird gimmicks, with the gamepad being necessary for most games, ruining that simple controller experience. Even today, with the success of the Nintendo Switch, people consider Nintendo to be the weird company that never follows the norm. And the Switch is a great example of that, but for the better, as the console is a portable console and a home console. While it can be used just as a home console, it's limited by the fact that it is portable, which gives it the same power as an average smartphone, unlike the other two rival consoles, which aim to have the power and quality of an average gaming computer. So really, ever since then, Nintendo is the only company out of the three never to follow the flow, but always innovate, whether it is for the worst or for the best. Though we can't deny that because of it, they are what they are today, the best out of those three companies, because of the innovation they bring. They are willing to take a risk and bring something new to the table, and most of the time, it works. While there have been flops along the way, if you can look past what we considered standard nowadays, you will learn to appreciate the different things Nintendo did to change the game. Literally. And the reason why I'm going on this tangent is because even after everything said, Skyward Sword was a good example of that. While it alienated fans and newcomers to try the game, it took a leap with one of Nintendo's most popular franchises and tried something completely different. But sadly, because of that, it will never be looked at as the Skyrim or of the Dark Souls of that time. It will always be the weird one out of the group, and the weird one within the entire series. And while I can't deny that that was the best route for Nintendo to take, I'm still glad they were willing to take the risk. And now with the fact that they have heard us fans and are willing to change those features for this re-release of the game, is really more than we can ask for. I mean, now new and old fans can experience this game in a much better way, because this is how most Zelda games were played, with a controller. And I'll be honest, even though I did look past the motion controls from the original Skyward Sword, I'm still really looking forward to being able to play with the proper controller this time around. So as pretty much said before, I am so excited for this game, and I cannot wait to let's play it once again when it comes out for the Nintendo Switch in HD. I think the fact that it is in HD upscale as well is another huge selling point for the game, as the game was held back by the 480p graphics it was output in. So again, please let me know your thoughts below. Anyways, I've been ZeldaMaster, and for real this time, I'll see you all in the next one.